Welcome to the tutorial for simple reading. If you take a moment and read the 4 steps for simple reading, what you're going to find is that they are very similar to those steps of strategic reading. But simple reading goes much less in depth than strategic reading. And in most cases, when you're assigned to do a simple read or to complete a simple reading of a text, it's going to be of a secondary source that gives you a broad overview of a specific event in history, much like an example from a textbook selection. So what I'm going to do today is model these 4 steps for a short reading that's titled The Culture Areas of the Eastern Woodlands. So just to sum up these 4 steps, the first step is simply asking you to review questions that a teacher has assigned you for the specific reading. After that, like you did with strategic reading, you're going to read the text for the gist, the main idea of the entire document. And once you target that gist, asking those questions, who, does what, why, you're going to write the gist in the margin at the top of the document, just like you did for strategic reading. The third step of simple reading has you going back into the text, looking closer at the information that the author presents you. And as you go along and reread for evidence, you're going to be highlighting and underlining all the information that helps you answer those questions that your teacher assigned. Finally, at the end of your simple reading, you're responsible to answer the assigned reading questions that the teacher assigned you, following the directions that were given with those questions. So here's our sample reading, Culture Areas, the Eastern Woodlands. On a quick side note, just to let you know, you live in the Eastern Woodlands of North America. Now, our job is going to be to complete a simple read of this document. Now, if you look at your steps for simple reading, the first thing we need to do is review the assigned questions that the teacher gave us. So I have those here on this little half sheet of paper. It begins with the title of the article, Culture Areas, the Eastern Woodlands, and you can see that it says reading questions. So by a quick survey, I see I have 3 questions that I'm targeting as I go through and read this document. The directions here say, complete a simple reading of Culture Areas, the Eastern Woodlands, answer the questions below on line paper, and answer each question using complete sentences. So my first question is, how does the environment shape a population's culture? 2, who lived in the Eastern Woodlands? And 3, describe the culture of Native Americans who lived in the Eastern Woodlands. With those questions in mind, I'm going to set those aside. I can still see them, and you're always going to want to keep your questions in view. I'm now ready to go through and complete step 2 of simple reading, which, looking at the reference page, is to read for the gist. So I'm going to be trying to find the main idea of this entire document. To do that, I'm going to ask those 3 simple main idea questions, who, does what, and why. So let's begin. Culture Areas, the Eastern Woodlands. Today, the North American continent is separated from Asia by the Bering Strait. Thousands of years ago, during the last ice age, glaciers froze so much of the water that the level of the oceans dropped. This exposed dry land between the 2 continents and allowed humans to migrate into America. By the 13th century, about 1 million people lived in the area that is now the United States and Canada. Cultures differed because of the land, climate, and resources in the areas where they lived. Some cultures were based on agriculture, others were nomadic cultures. Each group had to adapt to their particular environment, finding ways to get food, provide shelter, and meet the other basic needs of life. Most of the societies had little contact with other groups unless their trading and food gathering needs brought them into contact or conflict with other groups. The native people of the Northeast lived between the Atlantic Ocean and the Mississippi River. The area extended to the Great Lakes and above the lakes into Canada. Cultures grew up in densely wooded areas. Their way of life included deer hunting, fishing, and farming. A group of tribes joined together in a tribal association known as the Five Nations, or the League of Iroquois, in the area that is now New York State. These tribes were the Seneca, Mohawk, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Oneida. Other tribes of the Eastern Woodlands were the Ojibwa, the Potawatomi, Miami, Illinois, Shawnee, Ottawa, Algonquin, Powhatan, Huron, Susquehanna, Delaware, Massachusetts, and Mohegan. Now, having read that for the first time, I've got to go back and think to myself, who was this article all about? What were they doing, or what was it doing, and why? Now, always be careful when you're trying to identify the gist or a main idea, because the who may not be a person. It could be an idea, it could be an animal, it could be an event. Okay? So in this case, the title kind of leads you to think that the Eastern Woodlands might be the who that you're looking for. However, as you go on and you read the article, another possibility is simply people or populations. So as I go back and look at this, the first paragraph talked a lot about people moving. Then it talked about the culture areas, so the environment shaping the lives of people. And down here it talked about the people who specifically lived in the Eastern Woodlands. So with people popping up 3 times, I'm going to use that as my who. So either people or populations. And according to the simple reading steps, I'm supposed to write the gist at the top of the page. So I'm going to label it the gist, just like you've been taught to do for strategic reading. Put a box around it, and I'm going to begin by putting the word populations. Now, when I look for that second question to identify the main idea, does what? I could be looking specifically for what people are doing in this case, or what populations are doing, or I could be looking kind of in the reverse, what's happening to these people or populations. So this article talked a lot about how the environment was guiding or shaping the lives of these populations. So I'm going to run with that, and I'm going to say for my gist, populations developed different ways of living. Now, back from my studies in 4th grade, I know that culture means a way of life. So I could have put people developed or populations developed different cultures, but I decided to expand it and go with the definition. Populations develop different ways of living. Now, I have to ask myself why. Why did populations develop different ways of living according to this article? And what it was that the article stated was it was the environment that they lived in that determined what they would eat, what kind of clothing they would wear, what resources they had. So populations develop different ways of living because the environment or I'm going to say the environments they settled in provided different resources for survival. Now, when you're identifying a main idea, at times you have to take risks. You do a lot of inferring and filling in the gaps when you're putting together a main idea. So as you're summing this up to find out what it's all about or to target what it's all about, which is the gist, you may have to arrive at different conclusions in order to make a complete sentence that identifies exactly what the article is talking about. With my gist identified, I'm ready to move on to step 3 of simple reading. So I look at the reference page and it says I need to reread for evidence and highlight information that helps me answer these questions that were assigned by the teacher. So I keep them where I can see them. The first question again is, how does the environment shape a population's culture? Second question, who lived in the Eastern Woodlands? And third, describe the culture of Native Americans who lived in the Eastern Woodlands. So putting that aside over here, I'm going to go back right to that first paragraph and I'm going to reread. Now, as I reread, I'll be skimming and scanning and looking over what I've already read for information that helps me address those questions. Today, North America, separated by the Bering Strait, last ice age, water dropped, exposed land, allowed humans to migrate to the America. Nothing in the first paragraph told me anything to help me answer my questions, so I continue on without highlighting. By the 13th century, 1 million people lived in the area of the United States and Canada. Cultures differed because of the land, climate, and resources. Now, here, question number 1 asks, how does the environment shape a population's culture? So here it stated that cultures differed because land, climate, and resources of the areas in which they lived, their environment. So because of the different environments, they had different cultures. Now, it goes on to say some cultures are based on agriculture, some were nomadic. Each group had to adapt to their particular environment, finding ways to get food, provide shelter, and meet their basic needs. So basically for survival. So how does an environment shape a population's culture? Well, they have to adapt to it. So they have to work with what the environment gives them in order to meet their basic needs, which would be finding shelter, getting food, and things like clothing. All right. The last sentence says most societies had little contact unless food gathering and trading brought them into contact or conflict. That really doesn't help me with any of these three questions, so I'm going to continue on. I'm now in my last paragraph, and I'm looking again, constantly referring back to these questions that the teacher assigned me. How does the environment shape a population's culture? Who lived in the Eastern Woodlands? And describe the culture of Native Americans who lived in the Eastern Woodlands. I found information for this first question, but I still have yet to find information for these last two tasks or questions. And if I only have this paragraph remaining, I'm probably going to find it here. So, Native people of the Northwest lived between the Atlantic Ocean and the Mississippi, extended between the Great Lakes and into Canada. They weren't asking me where the Eastern Woodlands were, so I'm not going to highlight any of that. Then it goes on to say that cultures, so populations with different lifestyles, grew up in the densely wooded area. Their way of life, so their culture, included deer hunting, fishing, and farming. I'm definitely highlighting that sentence because that tells me how people in the Eastern Woodlands lived. Now, this sentence up here about cultures growing up in densely wooded areas, I'm not sure if it directly ties in with any of my questions, but if they have lots of forests and wood around them, that may be something they use to survive. So I'm going to highlight that because I think it might tie in with their lifestyle. Going on, it says a group of tribes joined together in an association known as the Five Nations or the League of Iroquois in what is now New York State. So who lives in the Eastern Woodlands? We've got the League of Iroquois, which was made up of, and they said it here in parentheses, the Seneca, the Mohawk, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Oneida. And then down here, it mentions other tribes of the Eastern Woodlands. So if I'm trying to figure out who lived in the Eastern Woodlands, I should definitely highlight all that the reading tells me directly about who lived there. So all of those different tribal groups get highlighted. Now, I'm feeling pretty comfortable about what I've highlighted because everything that I made yellow tied directly in with these questions. With my highlighting complete, the last step of simple reading according to the reference page is to answer the assigned questions as directed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back here, look at this sheet that the assigned questions were on, and go back and reread these directions again. It says that I needed to complete a simple reading of culture areas, which I did, and then I need to answer the questions below on line paper. So I have to answer these three questions on line paper, and then it says using complete sentences. Now, I'm not worried about that because the evidence I need, the key ideas I need to include in my answers, I've highlighted it all, so I'm feeling pretty confident. With that, what you would have to do is obviously pull out a sheet of lined paper, put your heading at the top, name, date, and period, and then go through and answer those three questions, in this case, using complete sentences. Now, when you have questions assigned for simple reading, they may not always be telling you that you have to answer them using complete sentences. So always make sure you're following directions. Now for this tutorial, I'm not going to go through modeling how to answer using complete sentences, but if you need assistance with that, seek out the assistance of a peer or a teacher, and they'll be able to guide you along. With that, enjoy simple reading and review this tutorial as much as needed to be successful.